Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 4 of World Regional Geography, when we finally get to the world regions. So we're going to start at what for many of us is home, and at the very least is the region that our university is located in, the United States and Canada. Now, before we talk about North America, in terms of the United States and Canada, I want to just introduce somewhat the idea of world regions as somewhat of an arbitrary concept. So there's a lot of different ways of dividing the world among different regions, right? We could consider cultural regions, we could consider physical regions, historical regions, and there's no perfect way of doing this at any given time. So the world regions, as we use them in this class, and here's the map as it's used in the textbook, it's important to remember that there's not lines out there on the ground between the world regions that say, "Welcome to this world region, you have crossed the border." Right? This is, yes, they're useful as an analytical tool, but they're not the be-all and end-all. So here are some other ways of imagining it, right? So here, if you look at the Western Hemisphere, Mexico gets grouped in with North America, Central America gets pulled out as its own little thing, and separate from South America, right? As opposed to our course, in which everything south of the United States border in our hemisphere is Latin America. And if you direct your attention to the big yellow blob, you'll notice that Asia, the continent Asia, just gets to be Asia. Africa is Africa. There's no subdivision of the Middle East and North Africa as a culturally distinct region. South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia likewise are not singled out. Okay, here's another way of subdividing the regions. We've got North America, we've got Ibero-America, which includes what has been called Central America in the last map, or part of Latin America in the map before. We've got Sub-Saharan Africa, divided from Southwest Asia, aka the Middle East, and North Africa by the Sahara Desert. And some familiar regions, except that further pulled out of Oceania, if you direct your attention far to the south right, we've got Melanesia as a distinct region from Australia and New Zealand. And you can also see divisions between East, Southeast, South, and Central Asia. And then all of the island nations in the Pacific get grouped into Micronesia and Polynesia. So there's a lot of different ways of imagining these world regions. Here we're looking at an abstraction of the climatic zones of the world. Alright, so what if we divided things this way, ignoring political borders or cultural borders, and just said what kind of climate is prevailing at a certain place on the Earth's surface? We could very well be doing it this way, and if we were a physical geography course, then we would be thinking more in terms of these climate zones. But we are a generalist course, and so we stick with the best abstraction that we can choose. We've got these world regions. So again, it's important to remember that it's not perfect. It's not the only way of thinking about it. It's just a way, and for our purposes, a useful way of thinking about it. The very first region we'll start with is one that, for most of you, is you're probably most familiar with, the United States and Canada. A lot of us have lived in the United States for part, or a large part, or even most of our lives. And on one hand, it's bad to start with this region, because you already know so much about it. On the other hand, it's useful, because I think during the readings, during the lectures, I think you'll find yourself saying, you'll definitely learn new things. You'll say, I haven't thought of it that way before. But from your personal experience with this region, you'll find yourself saying, wow, we're really missing a lot of the picture. There's really a lot more to it than this. And of course you're right, because again, in a course like this, in only 1 week, we're not going to delve deeply into the history of the continent. That could take an entire semester. That could take actually years of intense study to do properly. We're doing it now in just a week. So I want you to take special note of that discomfort, that scratching your head and saying, there must be more to it than this. And remember, as we're progressing through the other regions, as the semester goes on, put yourself in the shoes of someone from part of those regions who might say the exact same thing, who might say, wow, you guys are really just scratching the surface here. So something that, from this grand view of looking down from upon high at the world regions, it's easy to forget that within these regions, between these regions, there's all kinds of specific circumstances and different groups of people living differently and layered histories, and there's never ever only one way of looking at them. So we do our best in this course to give a wide range of views both on the physical side and the human side of the world regions, but your duty does not stop with this course when it comes to learning about these regions. If it's something you're interested in, let this be a launching off point. Certainly not the destination. So, that said, let us begin our exploration of the United States and Canada. Okay, so you probably remember that we asked you to come up with some words that you associate with each of the world regions. For North America, having taken out the names of countries, USA, Canada, and Mexico were pretty big here, this is what we were left with. So we'll make a word cloud like this each week based on your survey results, which is interesting on a lot of levels, but most basically gives us an idea of the sorts of stereotypes, the sorts of initial impressions that we have about a world region. And in some cases those can be instructive, and in other cases they're clearly inaccurate stereotypes or at least contestable stereotypes. But for North America, there's a higher quality version of this picture up in the module, so I encourage you to check it out. But for North America, we've got very clearly freedom, diverse, home, powerful, developed, modern, rich, big, advanced, democracy, football, populated, prosperous. So we've got a lot of terms which maybe you recognize these from your own answers, but this is more or less what your classmates are thinking about. So again, we'll do this with each region just to kind of take our own temperature when it comes to the impressions we have moving before we start learning about the world region. Alright, just to take a quick overview of some of the main physical geographic features of North America. We have, of course, two large mountain ranges, the Rocky Mountains in the west and the Appalachian Mountains in the east. The very southeast part of Ohio, we've got the Appalachian foothills. In the center of the country, we have the Great Plains. And here, a lot of lowlands, which, as you know, if you've driven across Ohio or around the Midwest, is a whole lot of farms. Here we've got the Canadian Shield, the Hudson Bay, and then further north we're approaching the Arctic Circle. Along the west coast, the Pacific Mountains and Valleys, it gets very rainy. The moisture is being basically blocked by the Rocky Mountains, which is why, of course, in the southwest we've got desert, but here there's a lot of precipitation. this is another way, a more simple way of looking at some of our climate zones. And here is, from satellite remote sensing data, an overview of the land cover of North America. So you can see in red where our cities are and their physical footprint on the landscape. And then you can see all kinds of different forests, temperate forests, tropical forests, shrubland, grassland, wetland, cropland, barren land, covering the continent. So in terms of land cover, physically speaking, it's a very diverse continent. We've got everything from some very, very tall mountains to a lot of flat, open spaces to the Everglades down in Florida. So there's a wide range of land cover variation and climatic variation in North America. And if you are from outside the state of Ohio, then you've experienced this firsthand by moving here, perhaps from somewhere warmer. Not too many places that are colder, but there are some in North America. And here's another view of land use, zoomed in more closely on the United States. And again, if I draw your attention to Ohio, you'll see that in the southeast, in the Appalachian foothills, we have a lot of forest. And then in the central and western, southwest and northwest parts of the state, we've got a lot of cultivated crops. In our case, a lot of corn and soy, which again, if you've driven between any of the major cities in Ohio, this is not news to you. So this is a very interesting visualization. Now, carbon dioxide, of course, when it's emitted into the atmosphere from anywhere, it affects the entire world. So it's not like some pollutants where particulate matter, airborne particulates might float over a certain region, and so the harms are mostly confined to that particular region, although in some cases they can blow all the way across an ocean or between regions. So a lot of the East Coast states, for instance, often complain about the central states using coal for power because all of the air pollution goes that way. But carbon dioxide does not work that way. It is, think back to the physical geography lecture and the explanation of the greenhouse effect. So no matter where in the world it's emitted, it's going to affect climate change for the whole world. But this is a really interesting visualization of where the carbon dioxide is being emitted in the United States. So primarily, this is from cities and built-up regions. Makes sense. That's where we're burning fossil fuels for energy. But we also kind of have this beautiful, in a way, pattern of our road networks. And look at all this fossil fuel being burned right along the interstate. That's you and me driving between cities, and also a whole bunch of trucks. So you, me, and the stuff we order from Amazon. And to give you an idea of how climate change will affect this world region, we'll do this for every world region. It's important to remember that there's not a universal, one universal symptom for the whole world. Some areas get hotter, some areas get cooler, some areas get drier, some areas get wetter. So what we're seeing here in this map is variation above the long-term average for January 2013 temperatures. And you can see this whole part of the country is significantly warmer than the average. Whereas here in the west, we've got some slightly lower temperatures. All right, here we're looking at precipitation. So we've got in green and blue areas that exceeded precipitation from the long-term average, but then you'll recognize the beginnings of droughts in the southeast and in the west and the northwest. Now, if you've been watching the news at all this summer or fall, then you've noticed that the fire season has been particularly bad in the west this year. There's basically a line of fires going all the way from California all the way up into Oregon and Washington. So, in large part, caused by, or at least exacerbated by, drought, which itself is caused or exacerbated by climate change. And then temperature-wise, this is what it looks like here on the left in Columbus. And here on the right in San Francisco. So these are sort of our normal ranges throughout the year. Boy, does San Francisco look a lot more temperate. Wouldn't it be nice to live there, unless you really like seasons? All right, now to kind of shift gears and discuss the human and the political side of North America. So, probably one of the most important, this is almost an understatement, it could be said of the world, but one of the most important aspects of this world region is the presence of the United States and the global role of the United States. So a term that we can use for this is U.S. hegemony. Now, hegemony, you may have heard it before. It gets used by different disciplines in different ways. For our purposes, we'll quote Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci and the definition of hegemony as predominance, although not necessarily through force. So this is comprised of historical developments and also material reality. So you're probably familiar with the history of the 20th century, the ascendance of the world order, poli-sci would put it that way perhaps, the United States post-World War II, our showdown with the USSR, and of course the collapse of the USSR, the global projection of the US's military power, its political and economic power, for instance, in its influence over multinational organizations such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, underpinned, of course, by the fact that the U.S. currency, the U.S. dollar, is used as the global reserve currency. So even countries that are not traditional allies hold a whole bunch of U.S. dollars because it's the global reserve currency. And the spread not just of American economic and political power, but also American culture, which is very evident if you travel throughout the world. You'll find Hollywood movies, you'll find American music, you'll find a whole lot of people speaking English, although we can trace that back as well to our big sisters and brothers across the Atlantic and the empire that they maintained for a while, but we'll talk about the British in a later unit. And even after the global economic crisis of a few years ago, the United States still has the largest economy in the world, depending how you measure it, although that will change soon, as at least in terms of sheer size, although not necessarily in terms of per capita income, it will be overtaken by China. And of course, the United States holds a whole lot of foreign debt. So the hegemony is tempered somewhat. Alone, it accounts for a quarter of the world's GDP. It is among one of the most affluent populations in the world. And remember, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this. Last week, we discussed Human Development Index as an alternative to GDP. So bear in mind, there's different ways of measuring it. The natural resources of the US and Canada are many and varied. And the highly advanced technology that exists in North America increases the exploitation of those natural resources. Now, in some cases, that can make it more efficient, and in some cases, it can enable the exploitation of natural resources that are actually quite dirty. So, for instance, the tar sands of Alberta would come to mind as resources that, because of the advanced technology available here, are within reach, but the world would be much better off if they were not within reach. And with all of that affluence and all of that technology comes a consumer base that is a major consumer of the world's resources in terms of both importing a lot of finished products, especially from East Asia these days, but also measured in terms of raw resources and energy. Americans and Canadians use a lot more than folks in other countries. I introduced capitalism previously in the Human Geography lecture, but to once again give you kind of a basic definition, capitalism is a historically specific form of economic and social/political organization, predicated on the profit motive and ceaseless accumulation of capital, dictated by a market logic and enabled by private ownership of the means of production. Of course, it's not smooth. It's replete with internal crises, and these occur in specific places and at specific times, which is why there's all kinds of unevenness and variation throughout the world, and then within world regions. Within, of course, Columbus, different neighborhoods are an uneven patchwork of accumulation of wealth. Responses to these crises contribute more to this uneven development. So again, that's a way of saying that the effects of capitalism are specific to specific places. So it's not like we can go to one particular place and say, yes, here's the capitalism. This is a process that connects different places through the accumulation of capital, through these market logics, through the profit motive. So it connects these disparate places and drives these processes of change and unevenness. It gets a lot more complicated than that, but to think about the way that capitalism has changed, especially since World War II until the present, we can divide, we can talk about the old economy of 1945 to 1970, the pre-neoliberal economy, and the new economy. So right after World War II and until the 70s, the organization of production was based on mass market consumption, mostly from Americans and later on Western Europe, but mostly from North Americans, because, for lack of another way of putting it, we were the only people who at that point could afford it. The organizational form of the old economy was hierarchical and bureaucratic. Businesses did not move necessarily between countries and regions, and therefore competition between regions was relatively low, because basically capital was fixed. If you had a factory in one place, if your consumers were in one place, there was a lot of inertia. You were more or less likely to stay there. But this has changed over time. And part of this transition is the history of Fordism versus post-Fordism. All right, so who's the Ford in Fordism? All right, that would be Henry Ford, who you may drive a Ford, or you may have seen them on the roads. I'm sure you're familiar with Ford. But Fordism refers to secondary manufacturing industries, where you have mass production, and the workers are in a lifetime unionized job. So this region, which we're in right now, and you may be from as well, is one way of defining the geographic extent of the Rust Belt, or the manufacturing belt. So in 1919, this was where most of the manufacturing was going on. We can see industrial bases, and we can see all of the areas that the bases were pulling from in terms of labor, in terms of subcontractors. Detroit and Cleveland, especially hard-hit Rust Belt cities later on. And as the economy underwent this transition from Fordism to post-Fordism, we saw a switch from manufacturing to high-tech, from automated mass production to tailored specific production, and from people staying in one job for life to people switching careers maybe 5, 6, 7 times throughout their lives. Here's another way of visualizing this switch from the old economy to the new economy, again taking place more or less since the 1970s. So the scope of competition has switched from national to global. Production is flexible and tailored rather than mass. The organizational form is networked and entrepreneurial rather than hierarchical and bureaucratic. Companies can have a relatively easy time of moving different operations from one place to another, and that has increased competition between regions. The workforce looks different as well. So the old economy was more focused on having full employment, which is to say very low unemployment. But the new economy is more focused on higher wages or incomes. Because people are often switching careers and because companies are moving from place to place, the new economy demands a broader skill set, rather than if you're going to be working in the same sort of factory for most of your working life, which has demanded a change in the way that workers are trained, meaning you need to acquire the skill of acquiring skills. You need to cultivate yourself as a lifelong learner if you want to be successful in the new economy, rather than mastering one particular skill. So that creates a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of risk for new economy workers, as opposed to the stability of old economy workers. But what's interesting is there is this legacy still of the old economy. So for instance, in places where there were a lot of manufacturing jobs 30, 40, 50 years ago, unions are much more well established than in other regions. So there's a lot more union activity in the Rust Belt than the Sun Belt. And we'll talk a little later on about internal migration within the United States. All right, what about agriculture? Well, North America is a net exporter, although we are also a major importer of food. We're focused on a few particular crops and livestock, so there's a high degree of specialization, and increasingly, it was definitely not always this way. This happens on very, very large farms, both in terms of physical extent and aggregation and economic aggregation. So, you know, this American ideal of the family farm is at this point outdated. Certainly much more of an image than the reality of agricultural production on this continent, at least. So production is mostly mechanized and from only a few companies. Export gets a little bit controversial. On one hand, the food that is coming out of the United States is very inexpensive because of the efficient way it's produced. It's also heavily subsidized by the government. So that leads to the accusation from a lot of other regions of the world that we are dumping. And this is a particular kind of economic term wherein the value that we're selling the commodity for elsewhere is actually lower than the cost of producing it here. And the difference is made up by the government subsidy. So we're dumping these crops elsewhere in the world because we grow them so much and so many and so efficiently that we really don't know what else to do with it. Some of this takes the form of foreign aid, which is sort of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's great to have food where people are starving. On the other hand, in certain regions, it's really not appropriate because it displaces their own agricultural capacity, and in the long term might do more harm than good. And we'll go into greater depth with some specific examples as we talk about other world regions on the recipient side. But anyhow, North America is a major donor. And here you get an idea of our major livestock and crop production. You see a lot of soybeans and a lot of corn, and certainly we live very near to those. Okay, the history of migration in North America. We're talking here only about the very, very recent history of migration in North America. Of course, if we were going to go back much further, we would give a lot more emphasis to the Native Americans and the First Nations. Anyone who's not a member of those groups is a migrant to North America or is a descendant of migrants to North America, although they often no longer think of themselves or their families as such. So the U.S., early on, there was migration from Western Europe, a major wave between 1820 and 1870, and also from Africa. This, of course, as I discussed in the human geography lecture, was mostly forced migration through slavery. Later on, between 1870 and 1920, there was a lot of migration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Canadians mostly hail from Britain and France. But, of course, the people who were here first are the Native Americans, or the term that's more popular in Canada, the First Nations. Since the 1970s, we've had the so-called third wave of migration from Asia and Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And then really interestingly, I've mentioned the terms already, Rust Belt and Sun Belt, we have internal migration. So this might already be you. You may not be from Ohio. Or this may soon be you. You might be from around here. You might be from the Midwest. But 4 or 5 years from now, find yourself in San Francisco, although no one can really afford it anymore. More likely, you'll find yourself in a growing city with net increases in population and economic activity. Americans are one of the most mobile populations in the world. We do a lot of moving around to find work. And here's a graph that represents a figure that represents the percentage of people who have moved within the past 5 years internally. So you can see that Americans are doing a whole lot of it. Europeans less so, with the exception of France. East Asia, South Asia, not so much. Although in East Asia right now, they're undergoing a massive urbanization process where people are moving from the country to the cities, so I'm not sure if that's really captured in these data, but anyhow, Americans do a whole lot of it. So the first stage of this migration, just as I mentioned, is happening now in East Asia, but happened a while ago in the United States, was from the countryside to the cities, and from east to west. This had to do with industrialization on the one hand, so if all of the work, all of the labor is needed in factories instead of on farms, then people are going to move from the country to the city to follow the jobs. But of course, it gets really crowded when everyone moves to the same part of the country, so a lot of policies were pushing people west, where there was more space. Although, of course, at the time, people were living there. Native Americans were living there, but European Americans were being pushed west. At the second great stage of migration within the U.S. was south to north migration, especially African Americans, so former slaves and the descendants of former slaves, moving from south to north, often at the same time as they were moving from rural to urban. And then finally, in the Rust Belt era, when deindustrialization took hold, there was a lot of migration to the Sun Belt. So here we've got the Rust Belt, here we've got the Sun Belt. This is a part of the country that lost a lot of population and economic activity, and this is where a lot of it went or popped up. So people moved, capital moved, because we were switching from secondary, so mostly heavy industry, to tertiary and quaternary industries. What that means is instead of a bunch of factories, we have services and we have financial services, which also fall under the names of knowledge-based economies or research and development. You might think of this as a form of creative destruction. So investments are withdrawn from certain activities and regions that were yielding increasingly low rates of profit under the old economy and are reinvested in new activities and new places. So following deindustrialization, fewer people were employed in industry in core industrial regions, now known as the Rust Belt. Other kinds of jobs popped up elsewhere as a result of this creative destruction, and so there was massive migration. At the same time, there have been these interesting twin processes of urbanization and then suburbanization. So as I just mentioned, early on in this process, a lot of people were moving from the countryside to the cities. By 1920, there were more people in cities than in rural areas in the United States. As cities became perhaps slightly unpleasant places to live for a slew of reasons, people started to move out of cities, but not too far, because often they were still commuting to the cities. And a very abstract, simple way of thinking of this, on the one hand, is some things were pulling them out of cities. So the prospect of being able to have a little bit lower living costs, a little bit greener of surroundings, and of course the potential to invest in real estate and grow your wealth. And then also some push factors, right? So a perception or the actual existence of safety problems in cities, pollution in cities. So both of these were combining to create suburbs. And this led to an increase in uneven development and an urban-rural divide. So to look in more detail at some of the push and pull factors, so push factors, we've got population density, traffic, pollution, and perception of lower quality of life in inner city. Now what's interesting is that the perception, especially among millennials, has shifted. Nowadays, a lot of people from your generation and my generation are saying, actually cities have a lot of interesting stuff, they have a lot of amenities, let's move back into the city. So this suburbanization may turn out to have been a temporary stage in the development of the American built landscape. However, one generation before, everyone was being pushed or then pulled by these other factors. So the idea of being closer to nature, although driving around Dublin, having a large lawn, being close to nature, not necessarily the same thing. More open space, bigger homes because property is less expensive and easier to build on, lower taxes. And at the same time, we see a racial shift in who's living where. So the most stark example of this is Detroit, where we saw incredible white flight. White people moving out of the city at an incredibly rapid pace, while African Americans were moving in. Spurred partially by these reasons, spurred partially by cultural reasons, and spurred also by government policies. on transportation, and on mortgages. So again, suburbanization has resulted in uneven development between inner cities and depressed areas and suburbs. Inner cities have high unemployment and high poverty, relatively speaking. Astoundingly, this has led to racial segregation, which is not simply a relic in the past, not something that ended with the civil rights movement or when our first African American president was elected, but something that continues, and also changes in housing affordability. All right, turning our attention to American culture, this is something that you all have experienced firsthand. Especially in foreign countries, the perception, or here the typical depiction of an American life, often goes along with being middle class, and that has a lot to do with race. An affluent middle class, focused on family, living in a nice suburban house, driving around in cars, watching TV, consuming products, keeping up with the latest styles. I think of TV shows like Modern Family. This is something you've definitely experienced firsthand, whether or not it accurately describes you. And of course, increasingly, it describes fewer and fewer people. It was never describing everyone. This was always an ideal. It's interesting. Canada is a little bit different. Americans are fond of thinking of Canada as kind of a footnote or the same but with a funny accent, and fond of saying A, but at least in broad strokes, there are some big differences in how Canada and the United States treat culture. So again, this is an oversimplification, but in general, as migrants came to the US, they were encouraged to assimilate, to learn the dominant language, adopt the dominant culture, literally get melted into this new cultureless culture, this new American culture, leave behind their roots from Latin America, Europe, Asia, wherever, leave behind their old languages, become Americans. Canada has been a little bit more friendly for multiculturalism, telling immigrants that they have the right to keep their culture, to retain their individual identities and heritage while living together and not getting into conflict with one another. Of course, there are complications on both sides of this. It's not like Canada has the formula down perfectly, but these are the broad trends and the differences between the US and Canada. All right, so here's that typical American family. They have $3,800 in the bank. Their house is worth $160,000. They have, 2.4 children. Oh, by the way, their finances are in shambles. So what did this come from? This appearance of normality versus another reality. So actually, there's so much consumption going on that Americans aren't doing a lot of saving. A lot of American families are experiencing some kind of economic difficulty, although it varies widely. There's a lot of inequality, and it's been increasing. So take a moment to look at how income disparity has shifted over the past 30 years from 1977 to 2007. The lowest 20% have lost a significant portion of their share, while the highest 1% have basically tripled their share of the income. And what's fascinating is that, especially post-World War II, up until the 70s, productivity, which is this purple line here, and real hourly wages and household median income were kind of increasing together. it's a good deal. As workers achieve greater gains in efficiency, as the economy is more efficient, everyone is getting paid a little bit more. And then in the 70s, the lines started to diverge, and have diverged quite a bit since then. So what this is telling us is that while the productivity of a given hour of labor from the average American worker is way more productive than it was in 1975, relative to that value being created, her or his hourly wage has not increased that much. And this is one of the reasons that folks who are making most of their income from wages have seen their share of wealth decline, while folks who are making most of their income from investments have seen their share of wealth increase. And while we think of poverty as something that is over there or a problem for other people, it is widespread in the United States, and also has particular spatial and geographic patterns, which I encourage you to explore in greater depth. You can do that here at the New York Times. They have a great visualization tool where you can zoom around. So for instance, let's pay a visit to Columbus, Ohio. Here we are in Franklin County. The poverty rate is 18%, so that's almost 1 in 5 people. And there are 210,197 people living below the poverty line in the county where we are right now. A lot of this was exacerbated by the 2008-2009 global economic crisis. And what's interesting is that while the recovery has been going on for quite a few years and the economy has regained most of what it's lost, those gains have accrued unevenly. So they've accrued mostly to the people in the higher income brackets, while the lower income brackets have not fully recovered still in 2015 from the global economic crisis. Okay, so not to end with gloom and doom, and I hope that there hasn't been too much of that. But I hope that this has given you a good overall view of the different aspects of this particular world region. Again, it's one that you're probably very familiar with from spending part or most or all of your life here. And I'll just reiterate one more time that all of this is from the physical geography to the history to the economic geography. We're just scratching the surface of all of the specificity, all of the complication that that exists here in this world region. And so if we've only captured part of the picture, which we have, it's important to remember that in the other world regions, we likewise are only capturing part of the picture. So if you haven't done the reading already, by the time you're hearing my voice, you should have. Please do. And good luck preparing for the quizzes and taking care of the assignments. And thank you once again for listening.